All right. Welcome back to the Formed Book Club, all you thousands and thousands of participants, which we hope someday to have. Not sure how many of you there are, but we're going to have fun, you know. Okay, we invite you to join us. Yeah. Who is us? Or should I say, who are us?
No, who are we?
Who are we?
That's...
Oh, yes. Who are we? Vivian Dudro here, our chief grammatician and Ignatius Press, Father Fessio, S.J., Ignatius Press. We're here in our studios, so to speak, joined by the real host of this show, Joseph Pearce, in South Carolina. We are now on our third session on the book, What Every Catholic Needs to Know About Salvation by Michael Barber. We had a fairly uncontroversial chapters 1 through 7. Today we're taking chapters 8 through 10, and there will be controversy, but fear not, next week we'll have Michael Barber on the show, and we can pummel him with our questions and objections and get him to clarify.
Is this when the book club becomes the Inquisition, Father?
Well, inquisition is a good word, don't you think? It's not a bad word. Inquiry. Just means inquiry.
Just don't put Spanish in front of it. Fine.
So, yeah, but even then, we're coming out with a book on, it was called Scandal of Scandals, but now it's called Scandal from the Beginning, or from the start, about the so-called scandals of the Catholic Church. There are scandals. We probably have enough today to fill out our menu, but some of the ones of the past were not so scandalous as is presently thought. The Crusades are one, Galileo is another, but even the Spanish Inquisition is a questionable thing. But we'll get to that later. Last week, Joseph, after we signed off, Vivian mentioned something which she was going to bring up but thought it might be too controversial. And I said, Vivian, no, that's what this is for. So can you go back,
yes.
Vivian, to what that was last week?
Yes, I was just worried it was a little bit running into the bushes or something. But on page 79, the author is making a distinction between Christ being made to be sin and Christ being a sin offering, and seems to be suggesting that Christ was only a sin offering. And I asked Father, well, didn't the Hebrew priests, when they gave offerings for sin, didn't they put their hands on the animal to actually transfer the sin onto the animal, so that this animal literally was taking away sin because the animal had the sin on him? And isn't that what Christ does? And Father answered,
I said that we still do that at Mass when the priest puts his hands over the gifts. That is both a calling down of the Holy Spirit, the so-called epiclesis, but it's also an echo of that gesture in the Old Testament priesthood, where we're taking our sins and laying them on the lamb that will be sacrificed for us. So that still is a liturgical gesture and a liturgical truth. So it's true that Christ is not only an offering for sin, but in some mysterious way, he became man. He did not sin, but he became sin for us. It's a terrible, terrifying mystery, but it is a mystery. And we can't, work around it by saying, oh, he was just an offering for sin.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. So that was that topic. We may get, by the way, you know that we have the Formed Book Club forum, and which you can get to by going to ignatius.com and clicking somewhere or other, and you'll finally get to it. But you can ask questions or make comments about anything we say or do during this book club broadcast. So proceed forward to chapter 8. Is that all right, Joseph? You're in charge.
I am? Okay. Well it seems that I'm going to be the relatively uncontroversial one this time, and I like that. I like being the one who's playing safe for once. But I want to just comment on something on pages 128 and 129 in chapter 8. When at the bottom of that page, 128, Michael Barber says, hell is not simply annihilation, but involves unending affliction. And I just wanted to sort of, to clarify, because it's so often, felt that, that basically when we die, if we don't go to heaven, we sort of cease to exist. So the worst that we can really expect is that, we just are no longer. And of course, that's not necessarily too scary a prospect. But but as souls, we are eternal, and we don't just get off that easily. And if we don't actually get to heaven, then we're going to be somewhere else, which is not going to be very pleasant at all. And the other thing on that page 129, I want to mention, Jesus also links damnation to sorrow. And then we have the quote from Matthew: "Men will weep and gnash their teeth." And I just was intrigued that being sort of interested in etymology between the connection or otherwise of the word sorrow and sorry, because I think they both have very similar roots in Old English. And of course, to be sorry is to actually have a sense of culpability and contrition. Whereas sorrow, if applying to the souls in hell, clearly does not have that. So when we talk about Christ being the man of sorrows, he's not a man who is contrite for his sins, because he's not culpable for his sins. So there's this difference between the word sorrow and the word sorry, which I think is important for us to understand and have clarity about, so we don't start thinking that someone is experiencing sorrow, they are necessarily sorry, because that's not necessarily the case.
Or vice versa.
Yes, indeed, or vice versa. Yeah.
Yes, I think there's somewhere in C.S. Lewis where this idea is put forth that there is kind of a conscious choice we make which leads to our own destruction as persons, that we kind of become unpersons in hell. Not that we are annihilated, but that there's kind of a disintegration. On that topic, someone who reflected a lot on hell and on Christ's descent into hell was Hans Urs von Balthasar. And I remember one point when I was up at the Rigi, which is a little mountain in Switzerland where the Johannesgemeinschaft, the community that he has founded, has a little cabin, Rigi Husli, the little house on Rigi, that I was reading C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce and mentioning it to Balthasar. Balthasar said, here's this great theologian, who's read pretty much everything he can be read. He said, that is the greatest book on heaven and hell that's been written. C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. And there, as you recall, Joseph, it's a dream, we find out at the end, but the bus goes from hell into the outskirts of heaven in this kind of purgatory. It's the opportunity for these people to come on in or not. And I remember George MacDonald, who was the one, he's kind of the Virgil to Dante here, is pleading with this fellow, oh, please, accept the mercy. And then, I don't want any bloody mercy. Oh, yes, accept the bloody mercy, But there's a statement there which I think is a classic statement, that at the end of time, there'll be those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. That is,
yes.
If you're in hell, it's because you've chosen to be there. But the interesting thing is that hell at the beginning, as it's described, is this place where it's moving farther and farther apart because no one wants to be near anybody. It's solitude. It's being on your own, And yet when the bus goes up to heaven, they find out it's just a little crack in the land. It's infinitesimal, so that there's something, and where heaven is. Lewis has this beautiful image, which he admits he got from someone else, that everything is heavier. You know, you're trying to walk on the grass and it punctures your feet. You know, you put your hand in the water and it gets bruised because the water is like rock solid. Raindrops come or dewdrops come and are like big blocks. So Lewis is trying to make the point that heaven is more real, more solid, more concrete, heavier, weightier than earth, and that therefore hell also is less.
Yeah, I mean the famous words of you have to resist the temptation of spending the rest of the show just on the Great Divorce, because I share your love for it. But again, what Lewis is all about is this life is the Shadowlands, and what's to come in heaven is more real. But if we take the alternative choice, because if growing in holiness is becoming more fully human, because Christ is the fully human person, and in becoming more like Christ, we become more fully ourselves as human beings. Then if we refuse that, we become less fully human. And I love the your distinction between annihilation, which is ceasing to be, and disintegration. That we're no longer the integrated whole that we're meant to be. We're actually starting to fragment because our own ego cannot hold us together.
And, you know, just as Paul tells us that eye is not seen, ear is not heard, nor has entered the mind of man what is laid up for us. That is to say, we cannot imagine the glories of heaven. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, around chapter verse 30, he says, some of you ask, what will the body be like in heaven? Because we all ask that, right? And Paul says, that's a stupid question. And Paul, then he begins to explain why it's a stupid question. But just as we cannot grasp, comprehend with our images and our experiences what heaven will be like, likewise with hell. So that all our images of hell, you know, point to something which is a mystery beyond our full comprehension. Now, you can say it's metaphorical, but as Lewis also mentions in the book Miracles, the same metaphorical does not mean it's meaningless. I mean, to say it's not really fire does not mean it's not going to hurt. I mean, it's worse than fire, basically, whatever that might mean. But I want to give you my experience of hell. Again, this is not the way to explain it. It's only one little aspect. But when I went to France, Joseph, you're going to France in a week or so. When I went there first, I spoke very little French. And I was invited to a dinner by this very generous young French couple. And it was a magnificent French dinner. And it went from 6 p.m. until midnight, just the two of them and myself. And it had all the different courses, you know. And we had, the main course was fondue bourguignon, which is not fondue savoyard is the cheese, I think. Fondue bourguignon is where you have the little pieces of meat, like a little centimeter cubed, and you got a pot of boiling oil, and you take a little fork and you boil, you cook each one, you dip it in the condiment. Well, it takes a long time, but the problem was I didn't understand French, and I would listen to them, and I'd say, "Oh, we bien sûr, oh, we." I mean, I tried to say like, nod my head, but I didn't know what they were saying, and I couldn't respond. So for 6 hours, I had this magnificent meal. I mean, different courses. You know, we had the cheese, and we had the entree, and we had the hors d'oeuvres, and we had the salad, and we had the dessert. You know, patisserie and everything, and then we had the cognac afterwards and different wines. And I was in hell. That is to say, I was here in paradise with unable to communicate.
Yeah. Allow me to go off on a tangent, then we probably should bring it back to the book under consideration. But bringing another book in, what you should do to actually meditate upon that experience of hell is to read the passage from Brideshead Revisited, where Charles Ryder is in the boring company of Rex Mottram in a restaurant in Paris. And the reason, the only way he can survive the conversation is to tune out and tune into the quality of the food.
All right. So where were we here?
Well, you mentioned von Balthasar,
Well, okay, let's get to that
and in
because
fact, this book quotes the Great Divorce.
does it?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean Balthasar's book.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to that. In chapter 8, which is not inevitable, salvation is not inevitable. The author, speaks a couple of times about, oh, here's the book, wrong book, who's in hell. And he makes these statements on page 124. First, the New Testament authors indicate that in the end, not all will be saved. Page 125. Though the New Testament indicates that God, quote, desires all men to be saved, close quotes, numerous passages indicate that not all will be. And finally here, a little later on page 125, yet Jesus goes on to make another point. There will be individuals who are not saved. And in this chapter, Michael Barber explicitly refers to Hans Urs von Balthasar and his book,
Here, put this one
Dare
up.
We Hope That All Men Be Saved. That is, Vivian is showing a revised version.
With a wonderful foreword by Bishop Barron.
Yes. But I have the old version, which I still have and is reading. And Balthasar is famous for being accused of saying that hell is empty and that we are assured that all men will be saved. I think it's very important to make the distinction that Balthasar does. Balthasar says explicitly there are two strands of New Testament texts. There are clearly strands which talk about eternal damnation, and the way is narrow to salvation if you have chosen it. The way to hell is broad, and many are on it. With respect to Judas, better had that man not been born. But there's never any statement that Jesus makes that says that we know that some will not be saved, and we know the proportion or how many. On the other hand, in the New Testament, there's a series of testaments. I will draw all flesh to myself when I've risen. God desires, God wills that all men be saved. That's in 1 Timothy, I think. And so you've got these two strands of texts, one of which clearly shows that hell is a reality in itself and a possibility for each of us, and another which asks us to hope for and pray for the salvation of all men. And how do we synthesize that? His point is you can't synthesize it. You shouldn't synthesize it. The problem is that if we're going to say we're sure there's a large number who are damned, it's always the other people. Thank God that we're not in that number. Whereas Balthasar says we have to hope for the salvation of every single human being, especially ourselves. And if we have a fear of damnation for anyone, the primary person we should fear for is ourselves. And so he is opposed to either the certainty that some are damned, and he makes it clear the church has never, ever dogmatically said that any particular person is in hell. But so we don't have that certainty that some are in hell. At the same time, we can't have the certainty that we or anybody else is in heaven except the canonized saints. We have to live in this time of hope, to hope for the whole human race and for ourselves that Christ's redeeming sacrifice will be effective in us. So it's a legitimate debate. certainly Michael Barber has on his side many, many great theologians, starting with Augustine, who is the one who basically began this idea of kind of a sociological discussion of who's in hell and who's not, in Dante, of course. Uh, but you have on the other side, you have great theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, Origen as well, of course, and modern theologians like Joseph Ratzinger or Benedict, who would side with von Balthasar. So it's a worthwhile debate. Whatever side one comes down on, existentially, we have to all fear for the salvation of our souls and not make fear our only motive for loving God and not sinning. But let's not take it away as a motive either. Hey, Joseph, you've taught classes, I've taught classes. You take away final exams, what's happened? People don't study. Love of learning, that's a great motivation. Fear of failing, that helps too. So,
although I would say, by way of just keeping the controversy rolling here, that that's because the possibility of failure exists. if they knew they were going to pass anyway, that then their final exam would no longer be something which would be very scary. I mean, the two things I would say, and I'm certainly not opposed to the von Balthasar Ratzinger position. I don't like to be opposed to anything that Cardinal Ratzinger said, quite frankly. But there is two things I would say. First of all, I think it's very intriguing and interesting, now you mention it, because I hadn't really thought about it before, that the church does canonize those that it says dogmatically and definitively are in heaven, but has never canonized those that it says dogmatically and definitively are in hell. And that's actually very intriguing. Although we do have, of course, presumably, and they shouldn't say otherwise, an assurance that there are souls in hell or spirits in hell, because Satan's there and the demons are there. So it's not as if hell is uninhabited. The argument is about whether it's inhabited by human souls, because
yes,
the demonic.
that's a very important point, because hell does exist, and Satan and the fallen angels are there, and Balthasar has explicitly repudiated what they call apokatastasis, which is an idea of Origen, that at the end, the final end, that hell will be emptied and will all be in heaven. And that's been condemned by the church and rejected by all the people I mentioned.
Okay.
Vivian, did you want to contribute something?
I do.
Give us the butterfly thing, Vivian.
Well, first I want to say that the only reason why Father and I are bringing this up is because Michael Barber does, right? And the book of von Balthasar that he explicitly takes issue with is called "Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved?" And when I get in this conversation with people, I like to say, you could rename the book, "Dare We Hope That God's Desire Be Fulfilled?" It's God's desire that all he creates comes into a consummate love with him. That is his desire. So dare we hope that this desire will be fulfilled? And the butterfly, I was saying to Father, different works, Joseph, maybe you'll appreciate this. Different works are different things. We use the expression apples and oranges, but the works that Hans Urs von Balthasar writes, it's as if a man is walking through a garden after a butterfly, right? He's not really trying to pin it down. He's trying to follow it wherever it might go, and there might be contradictory things at the same time, and it's all a mystery, and he's just kind of following wherever it leads. And then you get some of these trained theologians, and they're more like the guy in the garden who wants to get the butterfly in a net and pin it on a board and start measuring its wingspan and da-da-da-da-da. This is two totally different ways of understanding a butterfly. And I think that's a helpful analogy when we sometimes compare these different sorts of authors.
Yeah, I like that. And I can't remember if it was Keats. It's one of the Romantic poets that said that we kill when we dissect. That basically you have to want the life of a thing and not to actually know it so well that you kill it in the process.
Actually, he said it more poetically. He said, "We murder to dissect."
Okay, thank you very much. Who was it?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
I think it was T.S. Eliot.
sounds like
No, I think he's. This is a good one. Obviously we're going to have to Google at some point, but
Yes.
right,
Okay.
right. But the point being that the truth is a really big thing, and you're a champion of paradoxes, right? There are often these seemingly contradictory things in Scripture itself. We get these seeming contradictions between the descriptions of hell and the fear of hell on one hand, and this desire of God for all to be saved on the other hand. And you're like, how do you put these things together? And we really can't. So
well, as long as we distinguish, Vivian, and I know you do so, and von Balthasar does, and Ratzinger does, that an apparent contradiction, in other words, a paradox, is not the same thing as a contradiction.
right, very important
Right.
We have a
qualification.
contradiction. I mean, faith and reason is a paradox, all right? Because faith is by necessity something we don't know for certain. Reason is something which we know for certain, or at least things that we can apprehend certainly. So we know holding faith and reason together is itself a paradox. It's not Faith does not contradict reason, or vice versa.
So it's just important as we've been raving about this book in every session, haven't we? We've been talking
Yeah.
about how wonderful it is and how much we've all learned from it. And in this chapter, Father and I both came up against its limits, right? There's just limits to what we really can apprehend and express. And that's okay to be reminded that those limits are there. And that's not to disparage the work that's been done here at all.
No, in fact, it points out one of the great strengths of this work, namely, he's very, very scriptural. And so he's always referring to scriptural. But in this particular case, he will take scripture and he'll say, well, I quoted this already, but he says that the New Testament authors indicate that in the end, not all will be saved. Well, that's not true. They don't say not all will be saved. I mean, there are some threats. If, this happens, or if that happens, or if you're in this group, then you're lost. But it doesn't say that not all that not all will be saved. And then he does quote the passage from Timothy here. But he says, well, that doesn't really mean that God's will is that all be saved. Or I'm not sure if he does it, but the theologians will make distinction between God's antecedent will with the foreseen merits or demerits and God's subsequent will, or God's absolute will and his conditional will, or God's will and his permissive will. Those are interesting distinctions. But
yeah, if I could say something as well about the nature of this series, of course, this is something that both I work for the Augustine Institute, and obviously you work for Ignatius Press, and this is a series that's being published as a joint venture by the Augustine Institute and by Ignatius Press. But one of the challenges of the series, and it's sort of, I can liken it perhaps to walking a tightrope, is that because it's subtitled "What Every Catholic Should Know." On the one hand, you've got to try to encompass and encapsulate, but on the other hand, you have to do it succinctly because we don't want the book to be more than 50,000 words. And I know that that Michael Barber and I, as we were going back and forth in the editorial process, wanted the book to be much longer, wanted it to have more footnotes. And I said, well, yeah, but if it was then, it wouldn't be the sort of book we're looking for. This has to be for a general readership, has to be accessible to every Catholic, what every Catholic should know. And so to be fair to Michael Barber, he's had to, if you like, compromise some things in order to fit the thing into the constraints. And and if you do that, it's difficult not to fall off the tightrope occasionally.
sure,
Right.
we can lift out chapter 8.
To get back to the text, one of the things Barber emphasizes over and over, and we've emphasized in these meetings, is that if there is anyone in hell, he chose to go there. He refused the offer of God's love and mercy. And so, back to the great divorce, I mean, how long is it going to last that these people are offered to get on the bus and check out heaven and decide to accept mercy or not. Lewis doesn't say. This could go on. Who knows how long this could go
Yeah,
on?
I think, Vivian, the problem is that the process of disintegration is something which is ongoing. And so, in other words, I sometimes use the verb to golemize, but we can golemise ourselves through
Yes.
our pride, so that we actually cease to be rational. And Gollum is no longer a rational creature, and
Right.
it's
That's true.
culpable. He has made when he was rational, he made choices which compromised his reason. So that it could well be that we become so irrational through our pride that we're no longer
Yes.
able to reason ourselves into common sense.
That's right. So it's that's why we should all be in fear and trembling about uh, receiving these invitations from God and heeding them while we have time to do it. And and that's the point he's ultimately making through the whole book, that it's God's grace, it's God's invitation to enter into his life, but we do have the freedom not to.
Amen, sister. So that's chapter 8. Anybody want to comment on chapter 9, which is not just for other people, or chapter?
Well, there's one passage on page 152, which I think is in chapter 9.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that maybe I can read that because I just think it's just a good in itself. So the middle of page 152 is talking about Adam and Eve in the garden. Refusal to repent in the garden is the subheading there. After Adam and Eve sin, God comes to them and asks, "Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" Adam responds by shamelessly passing the buck. "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." With this answer, Adam manages to blame not only the woman, but also God. In effect, Adam says to his creator, "You are to blame for my sin because you gave me this woman and put her here with me." When God turns to Eve, she is no more willing to own up to what she has done than Adam. She responds, "The serpent beguiled me." Instead of confessing her guilt, Eve also points the finger at someone else, namely the serpent. She claims that he beguiled her, that is, tricked her. In essence, Eve protests, "It is not my fault that I sinned." And I think that from this, and I love the way that Michael Barber succinctly comments upon that passage and its importance. But I like the fact that one of the consequences of pride is prejudice, in the sense that we don't acknowledge our own fault. There's always an excuse, all right? There's always some other reason than the fact that we are to blame. The buck stops here, and a part of the psychological psychosis, if you like, sickness of pride is this blaming someone else or something else for what we want to do. And I think that psychologically is very, very good. There's also a wonderful painting, and you can correct me again. You corrected me on the romantic poets already, Father. There's also a wonderful masterpiece, I think it's by Titian, of the temptation in the garden, where everyone's pointing to everybody else. So, Adam's pointing to Eve, and Eve's pointing to the serpent. And God's sort of confronting them, and they're all passing the buck.
Well, who's the serpent pointing to?
Well, the buck stops there, huh?
Yeah, I know.
He's the one we know's in hell after all, right?
That's right. Good. That's chapter 9. Chapter 10 is not merely about the
Future.
future, yes. I read my own writing here. Often happens.
No, that's me.
So, yeah, salvation is something which begins in the present in our lives.
Well, what I liked about this, Father, and I'm going to mention it and then maybe pass it on, pass the buck to you and Vivian, because I hadn't thought about this before, so I can't really articulate it. But on page 172, I like the way that he connects Genesis with 1 John 2. The forbidden fruit in Genesis can be viewed as parallel the three temptations. Right. So the threefold lust of the flesh corresponds with the pleasures of the senses, which corresponds with good for food, etc. I don't know if you've got that open on page 172, but I would actually quite like and invite one or both of you to enlighten me still further about the connection of that, and then also on page 175,
Mhm.
how this is taken further, how Christ's temptations in the wilderness are, if you
Mhm.
like, the antidote to the poison of the forbidden fruit and the sin of pride in the garden. The two gardens.
Well, yeah, I think there's something to it. It's a helpful way of schematizing these scriptural passages. But on page 175, when he links up lust of the eyes with almsgiving, I'm sorry, that's pinning the butterfly to the board and trying to measure the wingspan. You know what I mean? It's a bridge too far. It seems to me. Whereas on page 172, I think that is a reasonable parallelism there between the lust of the flesh being the pleasures of the senses and the temptation, and the forbidden fruit being good for food, lust of the eyes, covetous for earthly goods, okay, and the forbidden fruit delight of the eyes. Pride of life is self-assertion, desirable to make one wise. Yeah, I think there's a loose connection there, but
Okay.
I don't.
So you don't think it's as watertight as is being suggested there?
Well, I do.
Oh, good. Controversy.
And furthermore, uh, on page 175, I would have added another column to the right. So he has the threefold lust of First John: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. In the next column, he shows how the three temptations in the garden, correspond to these. In the next column, he has how the temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness were, in fact, these same temptations. In other words, these temptations that undid man from the beginning, Jesus now faces and triumphs over. He undoes. This is the beginning of the redemption, right? Where he's undoing the disobedience of man. And then they showed.
This is Christ, Vivian. This is Christ as the new Adam, basically.
Yes,
Being
Christ the
shown.
new Adam, and
Right.
and not in a garden, but in a desert. I mean, there's so many
Right.
parallels and symbols here. This is one of those cases where you say to yourself, you can't make this up. The
Right.
layers and everything are so profound. But the three spiritual disciplines. Okay, so now here we are united with Christ, and this is the point of this chapter. We now are to willingly take on the penitential life, uniting ourselves with Christ. Here he's mortifying himself. He doesn't have to. We do. We are the ones who need to fast, to give alms, and to pray. And what the column I would add would be is, and what are the three theological graces that you obtain by those practices? By prayer, you grow in faith. By almsgiving, you grow in charity. By fasting, you grow in hope. And it's actually those virtues now that you're cultivating in yourself that help you withstand those very temptations that bring about your downfall. So maybe it's a little too tight for Father's taste, this schema. And I'm the one who's complaining about pinning butterflies to the board, so I usually don't like too many graphs.
Right.
But
I think actually,
I think
Vivian,
this is a really helpful thing. I think it's really helpful.
well, and I think that was marvelous. So Vivian, I really think that you've nailed it. Not the butterfly to the ball.
Well, also, you mentioned about the fact of Christ undoing this. There's a great quote that C.S. Lewis has from someone whom I forget, but Joseph, you don't remember. In Miracles, each chapter has a little epigraph there, which is very well chosen. But there's one, it's simply this. It's, quote, with backward mutterings of dissevering power, close quotes. This idea is that we're trying to undo something, with backward mutterings of dissevering power. We're trying to cut these bonds of sin and restore order, but it requires effort, and we're muttering. It's a beautiful, with backward mutterings of dissevering power. It beautiful.
And then you think about the goodness of the church in her wisdom to give us the season of Lent, to be, we're all pretty lazy, I mean, it helps that the church gives us a season and says, okay, here's a time now to practice these three spiritual disciplines. Why? Because now you can unite with Christ in the battle against temptation and sin, and have his victory be your victory. And that's what he means about we can start living the life of heaven now. Christ's victory, we can now start experiencing in our lives right now.
Yep. So that's good, Vivian, Joseph. Next week, we will have the author, Deo Volente, as they say, with God willing, if we're here and he's here, to discuss the book in general in a kind of a summary. The following week, we'll begin discussing Samir Khalil Samir's extraordinary, helpful book called 111 Questions on Islam. It's certainly something which is we all should know more about. There's been a resurgence of kind of Islamic aggression around the world. We've experienced it directly in our own country, not just 9/11, but even beyond that. And so we owe it to ourselves as Christians and as citizens to know something more about the good, the bad, and the ugly of Islam.
And from a real expert, Father, I always get, because he's got two names of the same.
I know.
Father Samir. Father Samir. He's truly an expert. He grew up in Egypt. He's fluent in Arabic. He went to the University of Cairo. He knows the Quran in Arabic. He's a true expert. And if I actually believe if you only read one book about Islam, read this one.
And I met him personally for the first time in Castel Gandolfo, which is outside of Rome. After Pope Benedict had been elected Pope, he continued his yearly meetings with his former students, the Schülerkreis. And at those meetings, we would invite one or two experts on a particular topic to make presentations. We discuss them. And the topic that year was Islam. And the Pope invited Samir to make a presentation and take part in the discussions. And I was just fascinated by him. He's very balanced, he's very charitable, but also precise in his knowledge of just what Islam is, who represents it, what their desires are, how they're trying to achieve them, how they look at the West. It's very, very enlightening and very helpful. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks.
A couple of things as well, Father, on that. I don't know if Father Samir could be available to be a guest at the end of it, or that might be more difficult.
I think we can do it if we can work the time zone difference. He's probably in Lebanon, but we'll work it out.
Well, he was at Marymount for a while.
Well, he was.
He was a professor.
Well, we'll work on that. Yeah.
Well, we could record the show to fit with his time rather than do it
Oh,
live.
yes. Okay.
And the other thing is, I'm looking as we've got the monthly, and because we've been doing 4 weekly sessions, I'm thinking with this, it's in 5 parts. Perhaps we could spend 5 weeks on this rather than 4. And if we can get Father Samir, that would be 6. That would get us back on the calendar months as well, which would be good.
All right. Well, I know 111, I think, is a prime number, so you can't divide it evenly by 4. That does make a problem for us. But
there are 5 parts, Father.
Okay.
5
And 5 divides evenly into 5.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next week. God bless you all.